Keith, welcome to the podcast. It's really nice to connect.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, so we've kind of obviously just agreed off air that we're going to start on the topic of thyroid function, which I know through following you on social media that this is an area that you've had a pretty deep dive into, it looks like. But before we start on that, are you happy just to share a little bit about who you are and your background?
Sure. I kind of fell into the fitness industry back in the early 90s after leaving the army and not having a clue what I wanted to do. And I was working at a leisure centre, and I literally somebody phoned in sick and said, "Can you take the gym induction?" And I said, "Sure." I didn't have a clue what I was talking about at the time, but it kind of paved the way into the fitness industry, into personal training, having my own health club, and then realizing I didn't like managing people. Then I kind of got involved in some of the Czech stuff in San Diego whilst doing a health and fitness degree. And then I kind of got involved in some therapy, kind of pain management, rehab work, which was what I was doing essentially from around about 2004, 2005. And then after doing some functional medicine stuff with the standard pathways like the IFM and things like that, I got I think biology was the only subject at school I was good at, but I think school was a very tumultuous time for me. So it kind of reignited my passion for biology. And from there, since 2010, I got more involved in reading lots of different scientists' work, like Dennis Noble, Albert St. Georgi, Hans Selye, a lot of the kind of other stress physiologists. And then in 2016, I decided to do a postgrad diploma in endocrinology. Then 2018, a master's degree in endocrinology, and I'm just about to start a PhD in endocrine sciences with looking specific activity around how hormones are disrupted by various pollutants in the environment. So kind of that's where I'm at now. Most of my work is done via online consultations where I work with people with kind of specific issues around energy, sleep, mood, fertility, this kind of thing. So it's a balance now between being a part-time researcher and a part-time coach. So that's where I'm really at the moment.
That sounds like you have a lot that you were doing. We were just mentioning off air sort of where we're at with our families as well. So yeah, that's impressive.
Well, it's daunting. I wouldn't. It's a challenge for me for sure. And that was, going back to university to do a master's in endocrinology was a challenge. I was feeling pretty out of my depth there, studying with doctors. Now I'm at a point where actually trying to do science without having done any major experiments apart from my own master's research is something that's totally alien to me. But it's kind of a nice place to be where you're kind of pushing some boundaries and feeling totally inadequate.
Yeah, humbling.
But
yeah,
absolutely.
I think it's certainly going to be exciting to sort of follow your journey and where that goes. But moving into today's topic, which obviously is incredibly pertinent based on what you've been talking about in regards to the environmental side and how those exposures can influence our hormonal health. I mean, I've heard many times that the thyroid is kind of the canary in the coal mine, especially when we're on this topic of environmental exposures. So I guess I'm just going to throw the ball into your court, which is kind of sort of where is a good place to start, do you feel, when we're kind of going into this topic of thyroid function?
Well, I think the aspects that got me most interested in kind of pushing the boundaries of my own understanding is after reading a lot of articles and some research papers and some scientists who are suggesting that there's a dogmatic belief that how thyroid is analyzed within the medical community is based upon these binary testing. And for anybody that understands how the thyroid works, first of all, the pituitary is often termed the master gland, but I think the thyroid is probably the master gland because it permeates every single aspect of function within the body. And, it could be reproductive tissues, central nervous system, the brain, the heart, the skin, they all need some level of thyroid hormone. And I think to the extent, and you see it mainly in medicine, there are people who kind of think outside the box of it, and there's certainly other research coming through. But the reason why I wanted to study it is perhaps to change the story about how thyroid is diagnosed. So when there's not enough thyroid hormone, for people that may or may not, I'll try and keep it as simple as at my level of understanding, is that when there's not enough T3 available, we often need more T4 to convert to T3. And that's usually happens at the at the hypothalamus will sense perhaps that there's this low levels of T4 or T3 by the feedback loops, will stimulate the pituitary by the hypothalamic hormone to influence that. There's probably some neurotransmitters also at work here. And then the pituitary will produce something called thyroid stimulating hormone, which will then exert its effects, not just in the thyroid, but in other tissues. We find this thyroid stimulating hormone receptor in many other tissues besides the thyroid. So what's becoming really interesting is that there are kind of various levels of inhibition of this aspect of thyroid hormone. Now, in our classic low thyroid states, we can see perhaps a high TSH and a low T4 and sometimes a low T3, but often the T3 isn't even measured in any shape or form. So unless we're looking at the T3, and perhaps we're just looking at the TSH value, and for anybody who knows the values, it's usually somewhere around about 0.2 to 0.5 to about 4.5 to 5 is suggested as being the normal reference range. So when it starts to creep above that, TSH is higher, thyroid stimulating hormone is high, T4 is low. Perhaps we're starting to see what we might call, hypothyroidism. Now, there are even many states, even before we get to levels of inhibition from various pollutants, such as stress, that can cause this TSH value to appear completely normal. You only have to take away someone's food, and in the short term, you may see the TSH go up, but there's a small window. It can also come back down into this very normal reference range. And this is why, and it should be done, is people should look at the clinical presentation of someone's thyroid state. Are they cold, slow moving, constipation, sleep issues, menstrual cycle irregularities, perhaps low testosterone in men, certainly low progesterone in females. And sometimes there's an interplay between higher estrogen levels in females because the thyroid isn't able to function and able to function at organs like the liver and whatnot. So we can start to see various things creeping in. And so unless you're looking at the clinical presentation and just going around this kind of what I think is a myopic binary belief that that's how you measure thyroid hormone, by looking at TSH. And some clinicians still just look at TSH, which is mind-boggling to me, because it's a complex biological system. And we think there's this one level of assessment that we're going to define someone's health by and dictate whether they get put on a lifelong course of single action medications like a statin, antihypertensive or high blood pressure, or perhaps even a glucose medication like metformin. But we know that there are plenty of studies, even if you just go and look at those very single actions, whether it's glucose regulation, blood pressure regulation, and even lipid regulation, there are plenty of studies that show that when you make someone who's perhaps in a subclinical state of low thyroid, that these values improve substantially. And then even the studies that don't show that effect, if you haven't considered how much stress someone's under, what kind of pollutants that they're exposed to, or even what diet they're consuming, how do you know that the values that you're looking at and then the prescription of, say, synthetic T4 or levothyroxine is going to do its job? Because if T3 is being blocked from functioning, or T4 is not being converted because there's perhaps not enough enzymes like the deiodinase enzymes as an example, then you're kind of just assuming that it doesn't work. And as I said, it's a very complex biological system. And thyroid hormone does touch every single aspect of that function. And I just find it thoroughly frustrating, primarily from a work perspective, which is great because a lot of people will go and see doctors, you know what it's like, and they haven't listened to the person, they haven't looked at the clinical presentation, they've just looked at this blood test, and they wonder why someone's not responding to the single action medications, their symptoms are getting worse, and all these other things are creeping in. When or 1 in 250 people would develop diabetes when on a statin. And that's come down to much less than 1 in 10. I think it was about 1 in 7 the last time I looked at. So if we're kind of employing biological reductionism to treat a very complex physiological action, I think it's just destined for disaster. I think part of it, you you could take a conspiracy approach, so that it's a lot more beneficial for companies to keep prescribing statin medications or metformin or antihypertensive, when in fact there is a hierarchy that could be treated much more efficiently. Equally, you could maybe not even need that medication at all, thyroid medication. You might just need to understand what foods are causing a good biological response and what aren't. So it's trying to deal with this level of complexity. And sometimes there can be some simple suggestions that create change. And sometimes they just need, I think, a little bit more teasing out. So we're not putting people on these kind of restrictive ideas that they need a single action for a single outcome, whatever health issue they might have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, you touched on a few things that might be helpful to dive a little bit deeper into. And you mentioned towards the beginning of that, sort of the role that, and often practitioners aren't necessarily asking or thinking about, stress levels, environmental exposures, and nutrition. So on maybe the nutritional side of things to begin with, are there some, how do I want to put it? Either are there some sort of no-nos when it comes to thyroid function, or what do you see as kind of themes coming up when you're coaching around nutrition and how that can influence thyroid function?
I think one of the most common themes I've seen over the last 10 years or so is the capacity for someone to think they're eating healthy, but it ends up being a very clean, restrictive, almost orthorexic type diet where it's as green or as brown, eating the colors of the rainbow. And I'm not saying necessarily these things are bad, but to the extent you're eating a diet that's quite high in perhaps the thyroid disruptors like the brassica vegetables, cruciferous veg, perhaps the cyanides, undercooked vegetables like courgettes, and aspects of inhibition of the thyroid at the thyroid gland itself, and then not getting enough energy. And there was quite a while where people were just scared of eating fruit because of the sugar content. I mean, and to be honest, 15 years ago, I was recommending that kind of diet, and I could get people quite lean and stuff, but notice aspects of function like digestion, constipation, sleep would creep back in. So, I've been there myself. I've been through it myself. And when I was kind of eating that type of diet, I was the biggest pain in the arse ever, and quite irritable and not sleeping and constipated. But I was a lot leaner than what I was. So I think it's understanding that it's almost trying to not fall prey to this naturalistic fallacy that we need to be eating everything in its rawest, greenest, brownest state, because actually plant toxins have evolved quite well to cause certain problems in a variety of organisms, so that you don't consume them all the time. And so to think that we need to keep eating that way, and this kind of, I don't want to blame yogis as an example, but you do see that type of diet in a lot of yoga instructors. And I've seen plenty of instructors who have had to change their diet to get better outcomes. So I think that's one of the primary ones. I think from other food perspectives, perhaps swamping themselves in lots of water. And again, I was recommending multiple liters. And I think the science behind water consumption is certainly not solid. And I think the more that I looked into it, caffeine doesn't seem to act as a diuretic as much as we thought it did. If you do any amount of exercise, that kind of level of diuresis is lost. And so we can get lots of fluids from teas, herbal teas, caffeine, and fruits and fruit juices, and even vegetables and starches that we cook. So I often find that this notion that you can increase your metabolism by drinking lots of cold water can actually have the counter effect, because you're cooling the body down, you're passing out heat from the body. If you have any kind of level of being metabolically compromised, and you're kind of constantly in a low energy state and not getting enough energy, and your body's going cold, you're peeing out all of your heat, you notice that your hands and feet are cold and your nose are cold, well, perhaps there's an energy problem there that needs resolving. And it can be a fine line between getting the right amount of energy in, not eating too much, not eating too little, and that can be just difficult for a lot of people to get their heads around, that they sometimes need to eat more to get better function. When you start seeing the loss of sleep, menstrual cycle irregularities, and as I said, in men, perhaps low testosterone, constipation. And I'm a firm believer, I've seen quite a few clients now that have been constipated for many years, and all of a sudden they flip to an irritable state. And perhaps the idea is that you can only accumulate so much damage when you're constipated, accumulate so much bacteria and endotoxin that damages the bowel before you start producing a lot more serotonin and histamine. So I think that's useful to suggest that that can take place. So I think water, I think the types of food, I mean, I think people need to be eating to open a lot more different types of food. I think there are certainly things that we can perhaps cut down on, like fried processed foods can be a particular problem for a lot of people. But yeah, I think they're generally the main ones that I tend to see. I have seen quite a few people who don't do really well on the autoimmune paleo protocol, and I think there are a number of reasons around that why it probably shows up some very good results in the first place, but then can cause problems if you keep staying on it and are not open to bring in some foods that are going to give you more energy and give you more nutrients that might be quite protective.
And on that kind of point of nutrients, are there some key nutrients that are just worth mentioning from a thyroid perspective? You mentioned the deiodinase enzymes, for example, which I think at least some of them need selenium and zinc, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big believer in some seafoods like oysters and shrimp. I think are particularly good sources. I think sometimes, some people suggest that you can get these from certain nuts, and I think nuts, as an example, they've often been sitting around for a very, very long period of time. You don't know how rancid they've gone. One of the primary ideas behind eating lots of nuts is because they have quite a high vitamin E content, but that's there to stop the oils going rancid, and it can only do its job for so long. So I think it's trying to move out lots of intestinal irritants that can cause a problem. Now, I do think those kind of foods that are high in zinc and selenium are particularly useful. I even think foods like marmalade can be particularly useful because they can just enhance digestive function and make you, there should be certain amounts of thyroid hormone in muscle tissues and in animal tissues that we eat. So being able to absorb perhaps some thyroid nutrients from the foods that we eat is a particularly useful way. Even getting necks and polyphenols and vitamin C, tropical fruits are really good because they're just very easy to digest, and still provide adequate energy and nutrition. And like I said, I think Paddington Bear was onto something with his marmalade sandwiches, because there's quite a few studies that show that citrus peels have a very, very protective effect on the GI tract, and even shrinking some intestinal tumors, which I think is probably a very good win-win to have that in your diet on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I love that because, I think the general public sort of view on marmalade would be, if we did a poll, that it's, packed full of sugar, it's probably something we should be avoiding, etc. So, those little examples of foods that we might associate with not being something we should consciously be adding to the diet. I love that kind of shift in sort of mindset ultimately.
Yeah, and I think people have, and again, I was guilty of demonizing sugar for a while, and until I looked at some of the more broader research on it. And even if you just think about the very simple fact that if you go to accident and emergency and your body's in a very bad way, the first two things that they're going to stick into your arm are salt and glucose, because they have a stabilizing effect. And to the extent that you can see, what sugar can do, it's like, sure, we don't want to be throwing down pounds and pounds of processed white sugar on a daily basis, but to the extent of having sugar in your coffee so you can get the benefits effects of caffeine, having some ice cream because you haven't had a chance to eat anything else for 4 or 5 hours, the body requires energy to function, and we can fall back on the more kind of reliant mechanisms that are there, like gluconeogenesis, breaking down fats and potentially proteins as a fuel. But the body runs very efficiently off carbohydrates, and that does include sugar. If you have it with adequate fats and proteins in the right amount, it can be a very, very helpful nutrient. But like I said, some people kind of take that advice and go, oh, he's recommending lots of sugar, then you're going to get diabetes. And well, diabetes, most people don't get diabetes because they're consuming high amounts of sugar. It's probably, a number of things like pollutants that I think are driving the destruction of the pancreas and the ability to utilize glucose. And so I just think that's an easy one for people to pick up on. But when you dig a bit deeper, I think you can just see that sugar can have some very protective qualities in the right amount.
Mm. And I just want to go back a little bit, Keith, because I lost you for about 15 seconds when you brought up, I think, the point that even trying to get some sort of neck tissue or meat, the idea of kind of going back to what we were talking about with thyroid and nutrients. Is that right? Did I hear that correctly before you cut off?
Yeah, and I think that we should be able to consume thyroid-rich tissues from animals. I think the problem is with such industrialized farming these days. My personal belief system is that there are hundreds of millions of individuals across the world that have a low thyroid. And now, if you kind of put that into a stressful farming environment, animals being fed subpar foods, poor animal welfare and husbandry, do we expect our animals to be having good thyroid function, or are they going to be just as stressed as everybody else that are trying to kind of navigate the rat race? So I think perhaps the quality of thyroid in animals has probably decreased substantially, but I think it's still possible that, getting to the right farm, supporting, small farmers and perhaps even, even some fish sources, you might still be able to get certain amounts of thyroid that can be helpful and restorative.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think, a whole new topic ultimately for maybe another day. But I guess, we've sort of discussed the role that to some degree stress can play here, the role that certain nutrients can play here, the role that almost really our overall energy intake can play within sort of thyroid function and physiology. But I think a really interesting point is the environmental side and the pollutants. So from your research, what are some of these pollutants? And, I guess where relevant, what might be some of the types of actual exposures to these, if that makes sense?
Well, I think if you think of any what we might call, there are plenty of endocrine disruptors and there are plenty of specific thyroid disruptors, and they all kind of have some level of interplay between how they increase or decrease function. But from any industrialized society or urban areas, you've got to think about what you're breathing in. So inhalation, and that could come from, the combustible elements of pollution, like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, combustion engines. Depending on where you are, close to factories, you can get perfluoroalkyls that you get in, your Teflon pans and waterproof products and non-stick products, and they were being pumped into the environment for decades before anybody did anything about them. And unfortunately, some of these compounds are termed forever compounds because they still haven't degraded over, many decades. And some of the older, compounds that have been around for 100 years or so as a byproduct of manufacturing, some of them are still around and they might be around for good. They just don't seem to break down. So, and there are many others of, there are many examples of plastics that can be found in the air as well. The average house seems to have a certain amount of plastic in the dust. Brominated flame retardants, which are pretty much everywhere, and perhaps cheaper furniture where they kind of sprayed with like a flame retardant. Certainly when you're traveling on airplanes, there's a certain amount, and I think they found certainly higher levels in aircrew. So all of the aspects, whether it's inhalation, absorption via the skin, some of these compounds with certain effect. And one of the probably most common is the thyroid disrupting pesticides that we tend to find, which can accumulate in commercial food sources. R-chlor is one. Some of the older ones like DDT and DET, which were kind of your estrogen pesticides and insecticides, as it were, they tended to be stopped a long time ago, but you still find certain areas in the world that do use them, despite the negative features of kind of, precipitating the likelihood of cancer progression and a few other things. So all of it really, unfortunately. In our water supply, we know that fluoride has an anti-thyroid effect. So if you're one of the unlucky people that's drinking fluoridated water, living next to a motorway, and eating kind of very cheap commercial foods, then unfortunately the amount of load that you're exposed to could be quite high. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the studies that have been done historically always looked at an increasing or a monotonic kind of dose linear response. So perhaps the higher you went, the more of an effect you might see. Unfortunately, most of the newer studies have made it even more complicated and said that you don't even need to keep putting these big loads on when you have them at very, very low loads that are sometimes even hardly detectable by some methods. They can accumulate with other compounds and other plastics and perhaps even metals as well, and cause many problems as well. So the disruptive effect is taking place at very, very low doses in these kind of chemical cocktails, as they were. So, there are certain aspects that are becoming problematic. I still believe that human physiology is relatively robust, and to the extent that we can educate ourselves and take out what we can and become stronger to some of the other kind of degrading components, there's still hope for us. But I still think it's very important to put, pressure on those who kind of don't really care about what they're putting into the environment. I think that's extremely important because it can have a very negative effect over time.
Yeah. And I guess what comes up for me there is, we're on, I guess in some ways now, the topic of detoxification as well. And immediately I start to think about the role that the thyroid plays within motility of the intestine, in certain liver enzymes, and just detoxification in the biliary system. So there's a bit of a double whammy to some degree as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the interesting things that I've kind of read about over the last couple of months is the capacity for some of these compounds. And if I kind of recall, it may have been PCBs and PBDEs, which are kind of another form of, flame retardants and plastics, is that they have an effect at the liver where they increase the degradation of T3. So you'll see things like enzymes and catabolic or breaking down of T3 in something called EROD, which is a way that T3 is degraded. You'll often see an increase also in the production of D3, which will kind of, take T3 and break it down into its kind of less active components. And you see increasing glucuronidation and sulfation of T3 as well. So it's not just getting low because we're starting to see T4 being decreased. We're getting alterations to the feedback loops where the pituitary is not understanding that there's a problem. We're not understanding that some of these endocrine disruptors can also bind into the thyroid receptor as well and have an antagonistic or an agonistic effect. They're being degraded as well. So we're getting kind of inhibition to the feedback loop. We're getting binding to the receptor. We're getting increased degradation at the liver. Now, if you were falling into one of the classic symptoms of low thyroid, which is constipation, as an example, can come from different foods that could cause that as well, for sure, is that not only do you have decreased liver function because there's not enough T3 available for the liver, you also don't have enough ability to deal with some of the metabolites and compounds, you could call them toxins, that are in the digestive tract that should be being evacuated. Many people kind of know about the concept of re-enterohepatic circulation, where because it's in the bowel and they need to be moved around, they're often reabsorbed, sent back up to the liver again, and to have an action again. So I think that's why going to toilet on a regular basis, and I'm talking 2 or 3 times a day, I think should be the norm. A minimum of 1 a day, whatever happens, but certainly 2 to 3 a day is ideal, is just normal bowel evacuation. And that can just be one of the easiest things that you can do to maintain your ability to excrete pollutants. I generally find that unless someone has really overt hypothyroidism, that you can actually get someone going to toilet every day with the right type of foods. That's not too much of a battle. In fact, that's one of the things I strive for within the space of a couple of weeks of working with clients.
Okay. And I think I'm right in saying that is the microbiome, I'm sure I've read that it's kind of a bit of a reservoir of T3 ultimately, or it's involved in the conversion maybe of T4 to T3.
Well, systemically, you'll get conversion T4 to T3 throughout the body. So it makes sense that it would happen in the digestive tract as well. I don't know about specific microbiome interactions. I have a slight bias to, and maybe you might not like to hear this, but I generally think that sometimes we overthink the microbiome. And I think it's just something that it's there and we have to deal with it. Yes, it can have some altruistic effects and symbiotic effects with the human physiology, But there are some really interesting studies where they've born animals into sterile environments, and they've had very high metabolic rates and lived just as long, and in some cases longer than the bacteria replete kind of counterparts. Now that's something that's very hard to even think about in the world that we live in. Yeah. We need to have, perhaps it might even act as a certain protective barrier. It might protect the brush border enzymes, the microvilli. There might be a number of things that the bacteria also play. But I think to the extent that we're constantly trying to kind of prop up, and I think that's why I love Ray Peat's idea that a 1 grated carrot a day with some olive oil or coconut oil is a great way of kind of neutralizing excess bacteria and endotoxin. It can have this very productive effect on bowel flora. And we perhaps suggest that even good bacteria can be problematic, particularly with lactobacillus and the negative effects of lactic acid that can be produced as part of that, or delactate as an example. So I think there are some very simple digestive things that we can do to enhance digestion, ultimately excretion, and keep the bowel turning over, all of the kind of negative stuff that's the whole purpose of evacuation, right? So I probably could be corrected, and there are probably microbiome experts that would chime in and say, yeah, I totally disagree with you. I'm happy that we all kind of have biases and we all can be right or wrong on different things. So happy to be corrected.
No, I think it's really interesting. I do agree to some degree that I think the microbiome has been such an area of attention, and my, I guess, bias and perception on it is, yes, it's very important, but it's almost like there has been an emphasis on one way, the microbiome influencing the body, and there doesn't seem to be as much appreciation, at least from what I see, that us as a host to the microbiome influencing the health of that ecosystem. It's very much bi-directional ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And if you think about thyroid as an example, whether you start looking at, say, whether someone's producing enough digestive enzymes or hydrochloric acid, ultimately that's thyroid dependent. Key signs of low thyroid function are hypochlorhydria and low HCl production, low pancreatic enzymes, and the thyroid signaling between the thyroid and the pancreas is so important. And I think that's why we start to see perhaps increasing in type 1 juvenile diabetes, and also the progression to type 2 diabetes from a relatively healthy state. So I think it's really important that we perhaps look at hierarchies, and if the thyroid does permeate every single aspect of function, we know it affects bowel function, we know it affects the pancreatic signaling and function, digestive enzymes. And I think there are some interesting studies that show the relationships between pancreatic antibodies, digestive antibodies, and thyroid, and low thyroid in particular. So again, I think if we perhaps look at thyroid as something that's organizational, it's differential, it helps tissues to kind of have a much more organized and coherent outlook. They know how to organize the physiology more efficiently. And I think when we start looking at kind of hierarchy and systems, rather than breaking things down ultimately to myopic kind of ideas that you do one small thing for this one small feature, which isn't going to have a vast effect on all the other things that are going wrong. And that's why I think let's try and be clever about this and go for the big dog driving the system, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I love what you say there, Keith, because it really just highlights the interconnectedness of the body, and the fact that, as you say, we can't isolate a organ, glands, or axes. If we think about sort of the HPT axes that we've been talking about, obviously in our stool test we look at pancreatic elastase, and you've mentioned that a lot of people who are hypothyroid often will have hypochlorhydria or low stomach acids, which is one of those mechanisms which then impacts on pancreatic elastase or digestive enzymes. But to know that actually there's more of a, I guess, a direct relationship between the thyroid and pancreatic function is just a great example of how we have to be thinking about these things really holistically. But a question that's coming up for me, and I think it's kind of thinking about our listeners listening to this conversation, maybe just, if possible, kind of a very brief summary of what are some of the other signs and symptoms that would indicate that maybe there could be something going on with thyroid function. So maybe things like heart rate, body temperature that could be tracked really easily. And after that, as a result, what are some of the things that you would be looking at in, let's say, a blood test on top of what other practitioners might, like we've mentioned TSH and T4, for example?
Yeah. Okay. So I took a lot of my reading around thyroid, first from Ray Peat and then looking at Broder Barnes's stuff. And Broder Barnes was a researcher, I think it was the 40s, who was saying that you could pretty much diagnose someone's thyroid issue by how much cholesterol they have, and also their basal metabolic rate. Now, I think there are some nuances in that. And if you speak to any doctor, they'll laugh at you for trying to look at metabolic rate and pulse. But I think if you spend some time studying them, you'll realize that there's a pretty credible, albeit crude, relationship between body temperature and pulse. In my master's degree, I did a very small study looking at how a correlation between the thyroid symptoms that you see and a low body temperature, but still the TSH would be relatively normal. So I think it's worth understanding that if you're someone who's prone to cold hands and feet, the lateral third of the eyebrows thinning, you're prone to seasonal affective disorder or kind of changes to your mood when it gets dark and cold. There can be other reasons behind that, behind light, obviously. Changes to digestion. I think it's even useful to state that some females go through a state of subclinical hypothyroidism during their menstrual cycle. If you have such a surge of estrogen, and estrogen can disrupt thyroid hormone function, you can go through this kind of state on a monthly basis. So menstrual cycle irregularities, I think, is something that should be considered. I think the digestive changes, I think sleep can have a huge play on it as well. I think wasting of carbon dioxide, and that's why I think bag breathing and retaining carbon dioxide can be particularly useful. A lot of people talk about how, say fasting as an example, and calorific restriction is great because it slows metabolism. But ultimately what you end up doing is kind of falling back onto a much less efficient form of physiology. So I think wasting of carbon dioxide can be a particularly interesting feature to consider within low thyroid function. For blood tests, I'm going to say something contentious because I think it really does pay to keep TSH well below 1. And I'll give you my thoughts around that, is that we should be seeing plenty of systemic peripheral conversion of T4 to T3. When that doesn't happen, we fall back upon the pituitary. And pituitary responses, I think, should be perceived as a fallback mechanism, and perhaps even a stress mechanism. We know that at high values of any of the pituitary hormones lend themselves to aging. High TSH is associated with fibrosis, production of interleukins like interleukin 6. High productions of or chronic production of growth hormone lends itself to both diabetes and cancer, and even kind of chronic production of perhaps the reproductive hormones like or the stimulating hormones like follicle and luteal hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and their effects upon the ovaries or the testicles. When there's chronic production of these hormones, they do have a very negative effect. So perhaps what we should be looking at is minimal pituitary response, rather than kind of looking at these bigger values that we have. And that's something I'm going to be hopefully teasing out within my research. What I want to be looking at is, is there a much better effect of supplementing with T4 and T3 when there's a higher state of pollution and pollutant disrupting effects on thyroid physiology and the feedback loops? And perhaps this might go some way to explain why T4, as an example, isn't appropriate for everyone. Don't get me wrong, it can be very useful for a lot of people, but I think there's a substantial amount of people, and there's a lot of researchers and doctors that might share my view from what I've read, is that T4 and T3, and sometimes T3 on its own could be a much better function. And this is where it comes down to the point that we are subjectively different. We will have different levels of inhibition of thyroid function, whether it's conversion of T4 to T3, whether it's pituitary responses or central nervous system and brain signaling that causes the response. So that there can be very different aspects to what is appropriate for one person and another. But I think this is where we should see a good body temperature of around about 37 degrees. And that's why temperature testing can be particularly useful, because if we're seeing people who are cold, perhaps that's a good suggestion that A, they're not eating enough, or B, their thyroid is not functioning as well as it could be. Equally could be, digestive inflammation that isn't allowing them to process nutrients, and we can still see various temperature changes. And I think as well that there can be another nuance to that, to the extent that someone's been low thyroid for a long period of time and they're into a chronic stress response and their diet one that's just being kind of kept up there by high responses of, you know, gluconeogenesis, you know, the need to break down fats and proteins involving glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol. So, you know, that's why sometimes if you've got someone that hasn't been eating well, you may actually see their temperature and pulse drop because you've taken them out of their stress response. And I think looking at some of these nuances can be really, really useful to, rather than say, oh, you can't, that person's got normal temperature, so their thyroid must be fine. What, how long have they been stuck in that stress response for? And that's where a good history and listening to someone is key over and say, okay, here's a TSH test, that looks fine. We are going to go the extra mile. We're taking basal metabolic rate, which actually that might be slightly different. But if you're looking at kind of body temperature, and as an example, you might see that being in this compensated state.
Brilliant.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, and it really shows us the importance in sort of that holistic, comprehensive approach and using lots of different markers to try and connect as many of these dots as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, even going back to the stool test, it's like I don't think they're not invaluable. Some people, I stopped using a lot of stool tests a long time ago because I felt you could give some very basic strategies to get people where they want to be. But ultimately, there can be some very difficult clients. They're going to need that kind of extra test just to, because when other things aren't working, you have to have all these kind of fallback mechanisms. But I do believe for a lot of people, once you understand what the thyroid's doing, how much you can change with your nutrition, and perhaps what the environmental and the emotional stresses might be for someone, I think there's a really good window for kind of keeping money in someone's back pocket and getting them to understand what's going on. But sometimes there's a need to fall back on some of the more complex, perhaps reductionist approaches that might just give us some information that we need that we haven't seen yet.
No, absolutely. I agree. I think, you know, those foundational changes, and then we've got numerous tools within the toolkit that we can lean upon if we're not kind of nudging that needle ultimately.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Keith, I'm mindful of your time, but is there anything that we haven't yet mentioned that you think is kind of really helpful and important to bring into the conversation?
I always come back to the point, I think, that a lot of people find this overwhelming, and particularly when you've been, you know, 10, 20 years of just really not getting to the point that you want to be in, like, your health journey. I'm going to quote Ray Peat again here, who said, when your thyroid's functioning, you can think about any subject any way you want. So to the extent that you kind of restored functioning of your central nervous system, your capacity to look at a problem, identify what the problem is, and then kind of restore homeostasis and function to the brain, you can either perceive the problem as something you can't deal with, or you can actively kind of take the bull by the horns and create some change. So I'm really about that when I coach clients, is that I want them to understand I'm not doing the work for them. They're doing all the work. I'm just kind of dropping some nuggets that in. And ultimately, I want them to perceive that change is possible by understanding all of the things that they do perhaps haven't actually led to their results. And that's why I send clients away for the first week just to do some data collection. I don't give them any changes at all, because I want them to get an idea of why their temperature's low, why their pulse is low or high, and why they're feeling like crap. And it's understand to get an idea of why you're feeling like crap. And it's perhaps some of the things that you're still doing that's causing that problem. And then we can start to look at things, okay, what's your kind of location where you live? What are some of the other environmental things coming in? It's a lot of information to take in. And that's the problem, is health is complex. And we like to have these kind of binary solutions where we drop one thing in, right, and expect change. And ultimately, that doesn't work for a lot of people. So I think it's really important to be able to think about the problem. And when your energy is kind of not where it should be, you find things overwhelming. You can't see the wood for the trees. And that's why I think sometimes people benefit with coaching better than, you know, not going to see someone, then being given a prescription. If they can understand why they've had a bad 3 days, and you have somebody looking at that, I think that's the beauty of a good coaching program, is to say, you're experiencing this because of this, now remove that and see how you get on. And I think when people start to understand that all of these things are kind of perceivable, just given the right inputs, then that's where the change comes. And that's what I'm all about with kind of how I work with people.
Yeah, it kind of, the word that comes to mind is sort of self-awareness ultimately, around, you know, what's driving what. I think that's a great tip for people to, you know, you can't, what am I trying to say? I guess ultimately that tracking can be really helpful, whether it is diet, whether it is behaviors, whether it is just general life and what's going on. You used the word earlier, kind of what's someone's load, you know, what's their body burden, and that obviously includes these environmental toxins you've been speaking about, but it includes everything. It includes our psycho-emotional stresses and things like this as well. So I think that's a really great tip for all of our listeners, which is just to become more conscious about what's going on in our days and lives and how that's influencing how we're feeling ultimately.
Yeah.
I had a conversation yesterday with a client who suspected that the new program she was on had caused a little bit of a flare up. But it actually turns out that at the same time, I think her actual saying was she's kind of been working herself into the ground. So obviously for her, the work commitment she was under was an obvious factor, as well as potentially obviously what was going on with the new program. But yeah, that context really matters.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's about becoming more within the environment rather than less. And I kind of always use the analogy, if the environment's constantly shouting at you and it's a one-way conversation, that's where you're more likely to succumb to the environmental influences. And to the extent that you can have a better conversation by weeding out what you can deal with and what you can't, and what's acceptable and that's not, then you can create some very meaningful and lasting change.
Brilliant. Keith, it's been such an interesting and helpful conversation. I think people are going to really find this interesting. And the thyroid isn't a topic we've had on the podcast before. There's such an intimate connection between it and what a lot of our community are experiencing with their health. So hopefully it's opened up, you know, new avenues for some people as well. Where can people find a little bit more about you, or where can they sort of follow you if they're kind of interested in your work?
My website is balancedbodymind.com, balanced with a D. I haven't written many blogs recently, but I've written one this year, but there's some going back for a good 5 or 6 years that should make sense. The rest before that isn't too much to read. Then I'm on Instagram under Tomo Littlewood, Tommo Littlewood. And that's pretty much it, to be honest. I don't think I try to, that's enough for me. I'm on Facebook as well, Balanced Body Mind, but it's hard to keep up with everything these days.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. Website, Instagram, and then that's job done.
Yeah, maybe room for one other more if it becomes important in the next few years, but yeah, I don't have much time anymore.
Sure, no, I can appreciate that. Keith, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I certainly look forward to following your work and hearing a little bit maybe about the PhD as well.
Well, if you see me crying in my hands, you know, it hasn't gone that well. So it's over 6 years, so we'll see what happens. But thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.